Amid the forested mountains of northern Sweden, the long winter nights were crowded with the restless dead. The living, isolated for months in villages, hidden amongst the trees, stayed indoors for the most part. They knew that the darkness did not belong to them. Things could happen outside the safe circle of their hearth that was best not risked or even thought of. In her cottage on a hillside, a young woman was awakened from her slumber by church bells. It was dark, as it would be, until almost noon at that time of year. But far below in the valley, she saw the doors of the village church were thrown open and light was streaming out in welcome. Although she could not be sure of the hour, it was clear that service was about to begin. In some haste, the woman dressed, wrapping herself in the warmest shawl, and taking a lantern to light her way, she set out for the church. None of her neighbors were in sight, and nothing broke the silence except for the occasional sound of ice falling from a tree and the crunching of snow beneath her feet. As she neared the church, she heard ghostly singing borne on the air. At the open church door, she sat down her lantern and composed her thoughts. Inside were rows and rows of hooded figures, and at the head of the congregation stood a priest clad all in gray. He looked up at the woman peering into the church and then went back to his prayers. She crept up the aisle between the rows of chanting worshippers, searching for a place to sit. Then help came. A gentle hand grabbed her wrist, and a soft voice spoke into her ear. "This way, dear one." Her rescuer guided her to the front of the church. The singers shuffled sideways on their bench to make room, but no one looked up or greeted her. Having seated herself in the pew, the woman turned to thank her helper, but the words died on her lips. The figure beside her had thrown back her concealing hood. The woman recognized the face at once, although it was much changed. It was the face of her sister, who she had laid to rest that autumn before the first snowfall. The sister laid a bony hand on her shoulder, and her rotted face twisted into an expression that might have been pleading. It was hard to tell, for the head was little more than bone in places. The lipless mouth stretched open to speak, but no sound came out. She pulled her arm free and began to inch her way across the bench. The figure gestured, and the woman found her voice. "You are the dead," she cried out sharply. At once, as if a spell had been broken, the singing stopped and a profound silence settled upon the congregation. Heads turned toward her and the hoods fell back. The woman felt a hand on her shoulder and jerked around. Before her was a skeleton, and behind it another. All up and down the shadowy rows swayed the figures of the dead, some still partially shrouded in flesh. Those dead the longest had faded to almost transparent shadows. The congregation began to move toward the living one among them, the bones of their feet clicking and scratching at the floor. Her sister's voice sounded again. "They have heard you. Run, for they will catch you if they can. They hunger for fresh company." The trembling woman rose to her feet. She was as quiet as could be, but each skull was turned in her direction, and bony fingers pointed. She edged off the bench and stepped into the aisle as ragged figures began to close in. She ran with the stench of death heavy at her back, with bony fingers clutching at her shawl as she crossed the threshold and leaped out into the cold night air. Behind her, a singular howl issued from the church, and then silence. Shuddering with fear, she made her way to her priest's house. She found him awake and preparing for Mass. After she told her tale, the priest, holding his crucifix before him, led her back to the church. The church was empty and peaceful. Her shawl, or what little was left of it, lay near the door, torn and clawed almost beyond recognition.